So, welcome everyone to our first fireside chat of the new year. We're so excited to have you all, and welcome to a new year of fireside chats, which usually take place on the third Wednesday of the month and provide us a more informal space to learn from some of our peers and then also chat with other landowners from around the Northwest. Today, we have two of our foresters who are going to be talking about ecological forestry. Kirk Hanson, who is our Director of Forestry at Northwest Natural Resource Group, and Jaal Maan, who is our lead forester. We welcome them both. Throughout the talk today, they're going to go ahead and get started with a presentation. If you have questions during the presentation, feel free to add them to the chat. And then we're going to leave plenty of time towards the end as well for folks to ask questions and have a little bit of a more informal discussion as well. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kirk. And then my colleague Laura and I will be monitoring the chat. If you do have any questions, feel free to drop them in. Over to you, Kirk.
All right, thanks, Rowan. Yeah, welcome everybody. It's nice to see some familiar faces and a few new folks joining us as well. Excited to talk about ecological timber harvesting this evening. Obviously, this is a huge topic, and Jaal and I are going to cover this at a very, very high level. As is the usual format for our fireside chats, we'll spend the first half hour sharing our experience with this particular topic with you. Jaal and I will be tag teaming back and forth on this. And for the second half hour, we'll open it up for question and answer and just general conversation amongst everybody. However, what I invite you to do, if you do have some specific questions, go ahead and put those in the chat. And Rowan will screen those as we go along, and then at the very end of Jaal and my presentation, we'll filter through those and select some of the questions in the chat first to address, and then open it up for more of a general discussion. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully successfully. And let's see, Rowan, can you confirm that? All right, thanks. Never know if that works or not. All right, ecological timber harvesting. So I want to start out at on sort of maybe a philosophical level here. I think one of the sort of obvious premises behind ecological timber harvesting is that we are in fact cutting trees. And so I think we have to start at that point. If we are considering ourselves to be ecological foresters, why in the world would we be cutting trees? And I want to put things into a little bit of a context here. And I probably have shared this perspective with you in the past during a prior fireside chat, so bear with me if you've already heard this before. But one of my arguments is that in most cases, when I visit, most forests, there's just too many damn trees. And what I mean by that is most of the forests, most of our second growth forests, most of our third growth forests that we're managing these days are overstocked. There's too many trees per unit of area for that forest to continue to develop on its own and achieve or provide all of the functions and products that we want from that forest. If we were to leave these forests at their very high density, there's all sorts of problems that can occur under that kind of stress. We can be inviting in pests, insect pests, disease. We are losing timber quality. Some other of our values and objectives may be compromised, wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration, et cetera. A lot of the forest owners that I and our organization work with are interested in setting their forests, on a long-term trajectory to achieve older forest conditions. It may be all the way towards, old growth, several hundred years in the future, or at least just older forests. Some of the values that are expressed around that are aesthetic. Some of the functions that are important to us are sequestering carbon, creating more structurally complex wildlife habitat, etc. But when we are dealing with very young and highly stocked forests, the ability to achieve this sort of vast suite of goals and objectives is very compromised if we don't take an active role in managing these forests. A lot of times I'm asked the question, well, what if we just let nature run its course? Isn't, is that a feasible option? And I say, in some cases it is. That surely, a highly stocked forest like this, given enough time, will thin itself out and gradually progress towards a more structurally complex forest comprised of older, larger trees. But during that process, this forest passes through a highly vulnerable phase. And forests are highly stocked like this are susceptible, like I just mentioned, to a lot of natural disturbance events. Could be pests, could be disease, could be windstorm, fire, etc. And so it really becomes a question of whether or not we can tolerate that phase of vulnerability to get to our desired future condition. So as ecological foresters and active forest managers, I think it's incumbent on us then to develop a suite of tools for addressing forests like this and move their progression along a little more quickly to achieve the desired future condition that we have. So forests all, are going to pass through several phases on their way from, a young forest to an old growth forest. And let's just assume that, our desired future condition is an old growth forest, or at least an older forest that is providing a lot of the ecological functions that older forests or old growth forests provide. And so if our objective is to go from this young, highly stocked forest on the left, towards a mature forest and ultimately to an older forest, I think it's incumbent on us as managers then to consider the primary tool that's available to us, which is thinning. And we're going to talk a little more about thinning as we progress into this conversation. But thinning is just another way of saying harvesting or timber harvesting. So one question to ask yourself as you are looking at your respective forest is not so much where are we, but when are we temporally in the forest developmental processes of your particular forest. And for most of our forest, we're in this what's still considered a young forest phase. I think most of the forests that I'm working with are somewhere in that 30 to 80-year-old phase. And you might say to yourself, 60-80-year-old forest to me is quite an old forest. But when you think about the lifespan of trees and forests in the Northwest that can live hundreds of years, in some cases, like in the case of cedar, thousands of years, most of the forests that we're managing and are still considered young, even if they are 30, 80 years old. And so that's something to ask yourself is where, kind of long developmental phase is your forest, and what is the desired future condition? Do you want to manage towards old growth conditions, or at some point along that phase, do you want to interrupt that, harvest the trees, and restart that forest developmental process? So a lot of people also ask, well, isn't all forestry ecological forestry? We are working with forest ecosystems. And I think, sure, there is an argument to be made there. And so what I want to do is just contrast two different approaches to forestry. The forest that we're showcasing on the left, I would consider to be sustainable forestry in the sense that trees are harvested, they're replanted, they grow back, they're harvested again, And that type of forestry is sustainable if we're never harvesting more than the soils are capable of growing back, across a landscape in a given year. The sole function, or one of the primary functions, I should say, of that kind of forestry is, of course, timber production. And most of the functional qualities of that forest are narrowed down to nearly a single objective, and that's producing timber. The type of forestry that we're showing on the right, ecological forestry, is managing the forest more as a whole ecosystem and managing it to restore the broad suite of ecological functions that are characteristic in natural forests. Again, carbon sequestration, watershed hydrology or protection of hydrology, complex wildlife habitat, certainly timber production, aesthetics, et cetera, et cetera. So under ecological forestry, what we're striving to do is manage for a much, much broader range of ecological functions and ecological values. There isn't anything necessarily right or wrong about either of these pathways. It really comes down to the objectives of the landowner. But in our context, our objectives being primarily ecological, we're going to put more emphasis on the production of ecosystem services. So another way to characterize ecological forestry and to look at, say, four of the kind of key variables to ecological forestry is: one, we are endeavoring as practitioners to mimic natural processes, in particular natural disturbance events. So in our silviculture, we are replicating the effects of wind disturbance, of disease disturbance, of insect pest disturbance on the forest to create more structurally complex forests that provide a broader range of wildlife habitat, and that also provide more resilience to these natural disturbance events coming into the forest. But we're managing, again, to produce the sort of specific outcomes that we're looking for. One of those may be improving biological diversity. We know that biologically diverse forests tend to be more resilient to natural disturbance, more resilient to climate change. Another aspect of ecological forestry is that we are intentionally leaving merchantable timber in the forest. So rather than clear cutting and harvesting everything, we're leaving trees standing that are merchantable to continue to grow to be larger, older trees that, again, provide some of the functions and values that we want. So a lot of times we characterize ecological forestry as less about what we're taking out of the forest, but more about what we're leaving in the forest. So I'm going to pivot now and invite Jaal to step in and talk a little more about the actual silviculture of ecological forestry and how we begin implementing some of these thinning or harvesting practices.
All right. Thanks, Kirk. Hi, everyone. Like Ron said, I'm Jaal, and I'm happy to be here on a Wednesday evening talking with y'all. And yeah, so what the main tool we use in our ecological forestry is thinning, like Kirk said. And this type of thinning we might do is going to depend a lot on where on that scale of forest age your stand is. So on most forests in the area, we're often doing a first entry thinning, meaning that it's the first commercial thinning in that forest. And that's going to be thinning from below, meaning we're taking the smaller trees, the less healthy trees, and we're trying to give the remaining trees some more room to grow so they can access more light and water. And then as we try to progress a forest towards old growth, if that is the sort of old growth characteristics are a target of the landowner, we would start on a second or third entry, doing more thinning across diameter ranges and across size classes. And that's what we're going to give kind of this what you see in this post-treatment image here, which has gaps, small openings. It has skips, areas that where we did not thin any trees out and it's more dense. And that gives some spatial heterogeneity, which is a big part of what's missing in modern young plantation forests in the area. And the next few slides, we have a few examples of some before and after treatments. You could go to the next slide, Kirk. This one, I think, actually is on one of Kirk's properties. You can see a before and after of a same or a similar stand of young Doug fir. Here we've got an aerial view with the thinned area on the left, unthinned on the right. You can see how on the thinned area, you can see through the tree canopy to the forest floor. And that's because when we're looking at, so when we're selecting trees to remove, we're looking up from below, looking up at the canopy and thinking, well, how can we open up some space between these trees, give them a little bit of room to expand their crown or their canopy. And the result of that is that there's a little bit of space between all the trees. And that's why you can see all the way through the forest floor there. And that's going to then provide more light to the forest floor, which can let some understory vegetation develop, including young trees that'll then create a second canopy layer eventually. And that's one of the characteristics, another one that's often missing in younger forests here, is they just have one canopy layer instead of the multiple layers like you would see in a mature forest. Next slide. I'm not sure if Kirk advanced it or not. His internet's a little bit laggy.
I did,
Oh, there
yeah,
we go.
it's a little slow.
We're there now. Yeah, this is an example of a landing in a thinning, which is where the logs were brought in to be, or the trees were brought in to be turned into logs. And you can see the forest all around it has been thinned. You can see through to the forest floor in some areas. And one thing that's also interesting about this landing is that they've got a lot of wood stacked on it, a lot of logs, but they've managed to keep it fairly compact. And that's one of the things that we do try to be aware of in these thinnings is keeping the size of landings small in order to maintain more room for the growing trees. And that's especially on a first entry thinning where the main priority is to get the trees to grow bigger faster because all of the things, Kirk will talk a little more about habitat later with large downed wood and things like that. You don't get any of that unless you have big trees. So our first priority then is to get those big trees. And so in that case, we want to have most of the forest growing trees, and we try to minimize the size of landings for that reason. And later on, you might have some benefit from a sizable landing in that it's going to create a gap that's going to have different species of trees and plants and wildlife using it. Go to the next one. So NNRG, we get to practice a lot of ecological forestry, and we also get the chance to do research on new methods of ecological forestry. And just wanted to share real briefly a little bit about one bit of research that we've been doing that's still ongoing, which is that we received some funding from the Wildlife Conservation Society to test out various silvicultural treatments at the Nisqually Community Forest, with the goal of increasing snow accumulation and retention, which is key for keeping cool water flowing for fish in the summer in the streams there. So in this photo, you can see the three of the treatments: a heavy thin on the top of the photo, a 1 acre gap on the right-hand side, and then the control area on the left-hand side, which wasn't thinned. And go to the next slide. Here you can see the results that we were seeing from that, which is that there's a lot going on this figure, but it's essentially a transect that we measured from the left to right here, going through the thinned area, then through the gap cut area, then through the control area from left to right. And so if you look at, for example, January 12th, which is that kind of light blue color, you can see that there was a good bit of snow in the thinned area, a little more in the gap cut, and a little bit less in the control. That was right after a big snowstorm. Then on February 19th, the purple color, there was a bit less in the thinned area, still about the same amount in the gap cut, and over half of the snow had already melted in the control, in the unthinned area. Where then on May 13th, the dark blue, you see that the snow is entirely gone, or almost entirely gone, in the control forest, and still hanging on a bit in the thinned area, and still a lot there in the gap cut. And then by the black line, June 1st, only snow left in the gap cut, none in the thinned or control stands. So overall, what we're seeing there is that the snow stayed in the gap cut about 2 or 3 weeks longer than in the control, and also stayed a bit longer in the thinned area than in the control. So this is something we're working to implement on future thinnings at higher elevations where snow accumulates, is to factor in how much snow is going to be intercepted by the canopy, and what is our treatment going to do to snow accumulation, and how long snow could last into the springtime. And the reason we're seeing we lost so much of the control so quickly, we believe, is that the snow that was caught by the canopy then was melting and dripping through the canopy and melting snow on the floor, as well as not accumulating there. So that's just one example of how we're trying to take ecological forestry a little further and always learn more, which has been neat. And yeah, now back to you, Kirk.
So one of the important considerations of harvesting timber or harvesting trees is the timing, in particular the seasonal timing. And a lot of what this comes down to are the soils of your particular property. Some soils are very conducive to operating heavy equipment on all year round. Those would be the soils that are more comprised of rock, glacial till, very well draining soils that have very little topsoil to it, where there's very little opportunity for disturbance. And some soils just do not lend themselves to operating in the wintertime when soils are saturated. And those would be your clays, loams, the softer soils. So one thing you have to ask yourself when you're scheduling or thinking about a future timber harvest is, what are your soils comprised of? And what is the optimal time to be working out there in order to protect your soils? For those of you that are also interested in conserving bird habitat and looking out for birds in your forest, you may want to opt to not be operating in your woods during the prime nesting season from approximately March 15th up until about the beginning of July or so, depending on the bird species. So seasonal timing is important for a number of factors there. You also may not want to be harvesting in the springtime when the sap is running in the trees and the bark is really soft. There's a much higher likelihood of knocking bark off the trees that you want to leave behind and setting them up for a disease or other types of failure. So, some soils, like I just said, really hold up well to logging on, and some don't. These are not pictures, by the way, from any timber harvest that NNRG has managed. These are some photos that Jaal found online. But these are soils, obviously, that are very soft, probably a loam clay soil that were operated on by a rubber-tired skidder in the winter time. And this is disturbance that we do not want to be seeing on the forest floor. That being said, when you're operating towards the shoulder seasons, whether it's spring or fall, and we're getting some precipitation, there will be soil disturbance. I think this is probably one of the hardest things for us to manage as far as the expectations of a landowner, is that there is going to be disturbance to your site. Whenever you bring heavy equipment into the woods, there will be some disturbance, soil disturbance of one type or another. And a little bit of mud, a little bit of soil disturbance, can be expected and will be okay if it's largely concentrated on the landing and on skid trails. And we want to avoid, heavy soil disturbance, obviously, in the woods itself where the trees are growing. One thing that I often say to people is that, logging we can use logging as a natural disturbance event, and it can be very beneficial for stimulating natural tree regeneration in your forest. And I think this is one of the benefits of coming in and periodically thinning, say every 10 or 15 years, is when that equipment is operating on the soil or on the ground, it's disturbing the soil, exposing some mineral soil, and that mineral soil can function as a seed bed. And we often see within the first few years after logging a tremendous amount of natural tree regeneration on those exposed soils. So by opening up the canopy, like some of the previous photos that Jaal showed you, and a little bit of soil disturbance can be an agent of stimulating new tree regeneration in the understory. I'm going to pivot back to Jaal to talk about some of the logging equipment that our logging contractors use.
Yeah, so like one question that often comes up is, how does, equipment used in ecological forestry differ from, standard traditional silviculture? And the answer is that it's a lot of the same kinds of equipment, and often it tends to be smaller. And it's an interesting balancing act because sometimes there are more specialized pieces of equipment that could do a little bit of a better job, but that might be a lot more expensive and it might not be available in the area. There might not be loggers locally who are using it. So we're always having to weigh the pros and cons of the different kinds of equipment. And it often does make sense to use more traditional equipment because that's what most loggers have, and it can make the job work out better financially for the landowner. But that really all comes down to landowner goals that, we try to tailor our management to a landowner's goals. And if they want, a thinning that's absolutely no compromise, the best ecological value they could possibly have, then we might be able to find a logger we can work with who has some fancier equipment that's able to have less ground disturbance and use smaller landings, for example. But for most folks, using the standard equipment does work pretty well. And what we've got on this slide and the next couple slides is just showing kind of that standard set of equipment that we work with on most sites. This is so actually on the last slide, you've got the processor and the log loader. So the processor is turning the trees into logs and the log loader is putting them on the truck. This is a pretty typical kind of landing setup. This is a pretty small landing. One of the people in the audience here might recognize it because it was on their property. And but you can see that they've kept it pretty small. There are some live trees right along the edges of these log piles. And that's, again, just trying to keep the size of the opening small. Okay, you can move on. This is the feller buncher, just the tree that's used to, or the machine that cuts the trees and lays them down for the skidder to bring them to the landing. And again, these are used on large clear cuts. They're used on small thinnings. They're made in all sorts of sizes and several different styles. So this is a fairly small one. It's not very wide. The ones you'd see in a large clear cut are going to be wider and longer, and they're going to have capacity to grab larger trees too. So the skidder, like I said, that's bringing the logs to the landing. This is a tracked skidder, which does create less ground disturbance than a rubber tired skidder because it has better traction and it has less ground pressure per inch because it has the tracks that's spreading out its weight more effectively. And we work with loggers who use tracked skidders like this as well as rubber tired skidders. The tracked skidders, the trade-off is that they are a lot more expensive to run. So in cases where a rubber tired skidder can do the job, that's generally preferable. And here's a rubber tired skidder. And in this case, what it's got there is a grapple full, not of logs, but of slash. So slash is the parts of the tree that aren't usable commercially, which is tops, limbs, small chunks that are not merchantable. Those in a clear cut, they'd often get piled up and burned. But in a thinning, we've got the great opportunity, because we're not having to replant, of redistributing the slash into the woods where it can be beneficial for habitat. It can build soil. It reduces rutting on skid roads. So the way that works is the skidder brings in a load of logs and then it grabs a grapple full of slash like it's got in this picture and brings that back out to either distribute in the woods or put on a skid trail. So on the next slide, you see some examples of using that slash to prevent more rutting and damage on skid trails. That on the left there, those small logs are placed parallel to the trail, and that stops the equipment from sinking in as much. And on the right side, you can see that was done as well, though it's wet enough that some of the slash just gets pushed into the soil. So it's kind of buried by the mud there, but it's still being effective at helping support that equipment running over it. And here's kind of a more extreme example of the same idea. This is a spot where it was getting pretty muddy and we were worried about causing too much rutting in that area. So what the loggers did was actually create this sort of a bridge almost. It's on the ground, but they essentially took a bunch of mostly low value trees and laid them down parallel along the road and kind of created this road surface that the skidder could then drive over without sinking into that wet area. And then, so if you have trees or logs that are used like this as a running surface for your skidder, they could afterwards either be pulled up and scattered into the woods or maybe even sold if you can get them cleaned off enough and they're not too damaged. Or they can be left grouped together bundled together on the ground to decay together and provide a unique habitat structure as they decay. And speaking of habitat structures, back to Kirk.
There we go. So I think one of the more fun aspects of harvesting timber, and certainly one of the ways that we bring our ecological practice to bear, is in creating more complex wildlife habitat structures in the forest. On the left there is I never remember if you pronounce it pica or pica. But this is up at the Nisqually Community Forest at about 33,000 feet elevation. And this is a deck of old logs that we had left that were not merchantable, and left it as a habitat pile, expecting small mammals to occupy it. And sure enough, little pica popped up in that habitat pile. On the right is a little more of a textbook habitat pile. And we had the logger take small diameter, non-merchantable trees, pulp trees, and lay them perpendicular to each other in the bottom, and then pile fine branches on top, again, to create a habitat structure in the woods. Some of the non-merchantable logs that end up at the landing when the trees are processed, the loggers will instruct to take back out into the woods and either stack up in parallel, like you see in both these pictures here. And these sort of stacked logs like that create what we call a constructed down log, which is intended to replicate some of the habitat functions of what otherwise would be, say, a much larger old growth log that now, of course, is missing in most second, third growth forests. When we're operating the woods, we also instruct loggers to avoid, to the extent that they can within safety standards, any existing trees that show obvious signs of wildlife habitat. This was at a recent harvest last year at one of our members. I think, Jaal, did you take this picture?
Yes, yeah. I can't take credit for finding it though. The loggers, I showed up and they're like, "There's a raccoon in the tree. Come with us." And we went on a little expedition to find it.
So, any existing snags, which are standing dead trees, will instruct the loggers again within the bounds of safety to leave those standing. And in younger forests or forests that just have not developed snags naturally, with this mechanized equipment, we can have a logger reach up and snip a tree high up, usually 20 feet or so, 25 feet, and create a snag. So as part of the logging process, then we're weaving in all of these additional wildlife habitat structures that are missing in the forest, or at least creating artificial structures that are meant to replicate some of the structures that would occur in a natural old growth forest. So that is, a very, very high level overview of just some of the aspects of ecological timber harvesting. We obviously, did not get into some of the logistics of setting up a timber sale, laying out boundaries, permitting, contracting, things like that. For those of you that are considering a timber harvest, we will at a later fireside chat this year be talking about some of those logistics in specific logging contracts, which are an incredibly important tool for you to have. It's your primary, legal relationship between you as a landowner and the logging contractor. And NNRG has spent a number of years creating what we consider to be a very excellent logging contract. So I think Jaal will be talking people through that and getting a little more into the weeds on the logistics of administering a timber sale. So we've wrapped up the first half of our fireside chat. It looks like we have a few comments or questions in the chat room. And if Rowan, if you wouldn't mind taking a look at those and letting us know what's there. And after that, we'll open it up for questions or anecdotes that people care to share from their own experience.
Yeah, absolutely. We have two folks who dropped messages in. Um, So Brandy was wondering, related to the gap cuts that were meant for snow accumulation, how many acres do you consider for gaps, and are there factors that might affect the size that you choose? And I think that's mostly directed towards Jaal.
Yeah, that's a good question. The term gap obviously doesn't tell you all that much. Um, we, for the gaps that we did in this study that I was talking about, we had gaps between a half acre and 1 acre in size. So that one that we saw in the image was a 1 acre gap. Um, but I've seen contracts through the Natural Resources Conservation Service for gap creation for habitat that are 3 acres, I think even up to 5 acres. They consider gaps for habitat purposes. So there are a lot of factors you'd consider, and I think what I would look at are things such as what are your neighboring land uses. If you're living right next to a 100 acre clear cut, you probably don't want to be creating large gaps right in your property near there, because there's plenty of that kind of early seral young habitat in the area. Where if you're surrounded by mature forest, creating a gap of a few acres in size might be really beneficial to have some more diversity in the habitat types in the area. Another big one is aesthetics. That some people don't like the look of a gap, especially when it's fresh. So keeping gap size small can help um, alleviate that a bit. And then in this snow accumulation study we were doing, we were also thinking about shading. That a small gap, even a 1 acre gap, really gets almost no direct sunlight on the floor in the gap, because the trees surrounding it are tall enough that with that low winter sun, it's not really hitting the floor and melting the snow there. So a smaller gap is going to have less melting from the sun than a larger gap would.
And just to add a little more commentary to that, gaps are not entirely artificial constructs. Like I mentioned early in the presentation, one of our objectives as ecological foresters is to mimic natural forest developmental processes and natural disturbance events. And nature creates gaps in a lot of different ways. Root rot or disease, fungal diseases can kill off groups of trees and create a gap in the forest. A micro windburst can create a gap in the forest. Insect pests can create gaps in forests. So, part of our effort here is to, again, mimic those natural disturbance events through artificial gap creation. And as Jaal was alluding to there, depending on the size of the gap, you may need a gap if you want to get, say, shade intolerant trees like Douglas fir or alder growing in a forest where otherwise you have, a continuous forest cover. So sort of a lot of rationale, justification, uses for gaps in forests.
Great. And on a thinning topic, Joan was wondering, what's the minimum diameter at breast height, DBH, for a commercial thin?
I guess I could start with that. It really depends on the markets is the first answer. So if pulp markets are good, it might not need to be very large. If pulp markets are bad, it'll have to be larger. And it's also going to depend on the acreage of your property, how much volume there is, because costs to move equipment in and out are pretty much fixed. So if you have a small acreage, then you would need larger trees to make that pencil out. As a general rule of thumb, I would say if your average diameter is about 10 inches or so or larger of the trees that you would be removing, then that's probably going to be commercially viable, assuming you have at least 10 acres, ideally, maybe 5, depending on conditions. So it really just depends on the site. But if your average of the trees you'd be removing are over about 10 inches, that's about the break point. But it is important to remember that's the average of the trees you're removing, meaning if you're looking at a first entry thinning from below, you're going to be leaving the largest trees out there. So you might have an overall average of 12 inches, but your average of the ones you'd be removing could still only be 9, for example.
Great.
But if you do have a forest that you're interested in thinning and you're curious if it's there or not, we're always happy to come out and take a look. And that's something we're trying to do a little more of this in this new year, is some more site visits out to people's properties. So if you're curious, let us know. You can come take a look.
Yeah. Especially for folks who are in the South Puget Sound area, which is where most of our foresters are located. If you're within about, say, an hour and a half of Tacoma or Olympia, we would be happy to give you a free site visit. So if that is of interest, feel free to reach out to us. Um, Ruth also was asking about in the sustainable forestry example, as opposed to the ecological forestry that we were presenting, how is the soil maintained long term? Because if the tree is removed repetitively, that would normally, in agriculture, that requires fertilizer application because it leaches the nutrients.
That's a great question. I'm not sure that I have a good answer to that. I'd be curious to see if Jaal has one. I think that's one of the big questions of, repeated clear cutting on a site. How does that affect soils in the long term? One thing that, we can say is the tree that is removed during clear cutting represents only a small fraction of the total biomass that tree is going to produce over its lifetime, or at least until it's harvested. And what I mean by that is, as that tree is growing, it's constantly shedding needles, leaves, if it's a hardwood, branches, other types of organic matter, and feeding the soil. So that's, I think, oftentimes overlooked and not really well understood. But I think that's still one of the questions that remains about repeated clear cutting like that, is, what are the long-term impacts to soil nutrients? I myself haven't read any studies one way or the other about that. Intuitively, I would say that's one of the benefits of thinning. We're keeping the forest intact and the majority of its ecological functions intact, and using, an investment metaphor, just periodically skimming the interest off that forest while leaving the principal to continue to grow over time. And again, all of the ecological functions that principle provides. But yeah, Jaal, do you have any other insight into that?
Yeah, I've looked into this a little bit because it's a question that I've wondered about myself, and we've gotten from other people too. And the best I've been able to find is that I think that's not something that's been seen yet, because we're really on, third, maybe fourth rotation at most on our forest lands here. So I think we haven't been doing industrial forestry enough yet to see that effect. I think it's definitely of concern for, folks who want to manage timberland industrially in that way long term. And there's been some experimentation with fertilization, but for the most part, in most of our forests, our trees aren't nutrient limited. They're more likely to be limited by water and sunlight. So they can deplete some nutrients out of the soil without actually seeing the effect in the trees, because that's not generally the limiting factor. And in experiments with fertilization that have been done, it's only effective in limited scenarios where your soils are deficient in some nutrient that the trees can take advantage of. So yeah, it's not really being seen yet, but it could eventually. Just not. I don't think anyone's really sure how long it might take to get there. Because in the farming example, you're every year you're doing a harvest, but in forestry, even the most industrial and the most industrially managed timberland, you're still waiting at least 30 years in between harvests. And like Kirk said, you've got a lot of material coming down into the forest floor every year, and there's always material left on site after harvest. Even if you are piling and burning, there's still quite a bit left to feed the forest floor.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to have a little bit more of a discussion or wants to ask their own question, you're also welcome to take yourself off mute. We have reached the more free-flowing and informal part of the conversation, so definitely welcome your voices as well as your chats, whichever you prefer.
I would love to hear stories from folks. If anybody has any anecdotes they want to share from any thinning, harvesting they've done, or again, if you've had any questions that you have not been put into the chat yet, feel free to ask. Happy to take this in any direction you want to go. This is your time.
I have Hello.
Yep, we can hear you,
I hear you.
Maan.
Oh, so how long does it take for a overcrowded stand of, let's say, 30 or 40-year trees? Uh, how long does it take for them to recover after you get in there and thin them to appropriate distances?
Oh, it's a good question. I guess it depends on, how you define recover. There's a number of different ways to look at that. Generally speaking, I think the general rule of thumb is that it usually takes about 5 years before we see the effective thinning on the growth of that tree. So in other words, one thing that has to happen is the live crown of that tree, the portion of the tree that has live green needles, live leaves on it, needs to grow before it really starts affecting the diameter growth of the tree significantly. So we thin a forest, we usually leave the more dominant trees behind that have large crowns to begin with. If they already have ample crowns, that diameter growth, the overall volume growth of the tree may continue, on the same trajectory. I think in your case, you're describing a stand that was, highly stocked in a highly competitive phase. So in those kind of circumstances, it usually will take at least 5 years for those crowns to kind of rebuild and then drive the growth of the tree. And if you were to go in and core the tree and look at those annual incremental growth rings, it's usually again after 5 years that we start seeing the incremental growth beginning to widen. If you want to add anything else to that, Joel.
No, I think you covered that. I would agree with 5 years. Yeah.
Yeah, it's always interesting going into the stand after a thinning, and if you core the trees, you can see how long it took before the trees kind of were able to, and then also realize that they could put on more growth sustainably without having to compete with other trees. Um, RD did chime in with a little bit more information about soil productivity. For maintenance of soil productivity, there are best management practices that emphasize retaining the organic layer and duff layer and not disturbing the soil on more than 20% of the area. Retaining branches and downed logs is also important. The understory plants are also an important component of forest nutrition, as are hardwood trees. And so we have two more questions. Martha asked, in the life of a forest, when is the most carbon sequestered? That's a good question. And then after that, I see Paul raised his hand.
Yeah, John, I'll let you answer that. You've been doing some carbon modeling for us.
Yeah, I mean it's essentially when the tree is growing faster, it's sequestering more carbon, and it's also a factor of how many trees you have. That an individual tree growing quickly is going to sequester more carbon, and if you have a lot of trees growing quickly, it's going to sequester more carbon. But if you have too many trees, then they're not going to be growing as quickly, and then it starts to get a little more complicated. Is your extremely dense, slower growing forest storing more carbon more quickly than if it were more thinned out with fewer trees growing more quickly? Yeah, that's a kind of confusing answer, I think, to a kind of difficult question. But
one that we've been asked enough that we are planning to have a fireside chat dedicated to it later this spring. So a very proactive question as well.
We are, and I think another interesting component there is that the forest continues to store carbon. So I'm reading your question as when is the most carbon sequestered, per acre per year. But the older the forest gets, the more carbon it's going to be holding. And at some point that will start to slow down, but it will be holding a massive amount of carbon at that point. So essentially if you're doing even-aged forestry, we have done some modeling, other folks have too, that extending the rotation age, for example, from 40 years to clear cut to 80 years to clear cut, you're going to store a lot more carbon and also harvest more volume per acre per year as well, on the order of about 50% more. But again, that's something we'll get into in a lot more depth on a future fireside chat.
Yes,
Yeah,
so
let's
stay
take
tuned to your
Paul's
newsletter.
question.
Hi, thanks for doing this. It was really helpful. We've been through two thins on our forest, one in 2010 and one in 2019. And as far as anecdotes go, the first thin can be really traumatic in the sense of how it changes the look of your forest. But be assured it won't take very long for it to start on this new trajectory that, our 2010 thin, we now have 12-year-old trees that were planted in the gaps because we only harvested alder and left all the big conifers. And so just in a matter of 10 years, 12 years, we now have a much more structurally complex forest. So as far as a question goes, you didn't mention replanting. And so I just wondered if you, in the last few minutes, you could say a few things about replanting options after these commercial thins.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a great question. Well, I think one way I touched on that was, I think one of the benefits of thinning is that the mechanical disturbance to the soils and opening the canopy stimulates natural tree regeneration. What will often happen in those cases is the natural tree regeneration trends towards shade tolerant trees like cedar, hemlock, grand fir, what have you. So it really depends again on what your objectives are. If you want to get another species into your forest to add more diversity or to achieve a particular objective, say Douglas fir, then you may need to come back in and replant. The other thing with natural regeneration is it tends to be very, very haphazard. You get a lot of trees over here, a few there, nothing back there, a bunch more over there, but it's not, a well-distributed stocking through the understory. So if your objective is at least to manage, for timber production, you want to have, a better, more well-distributed understory stocking of new seedlings, then you may need to come back and replant. Also from a climate adaptation standpoint, knowing again your soils, are your soils droughty or do they retain soil moisture? Even though you may be getting a lot of natural regeneration, those trees may not necessarily be suitable for your soils in the long run, such as hemlock, which is not very drought tolerant, regenerating on, say, glacial till, well-drained soils. In those kind of instances, you may want to come in and be planting, more drought tolerant species, like Douglas fir, even western red cedar in some circumstances, big leaf maple, what have you. Somebody mentioned hardwoods, and we haven't touched on that also, that, in our thinning, we're both retaining hardwoods and post-harvesting, coming back and replanting hardwoods if they are underrepresented in the forest, both for their nutrient cycling value, their wildlife habitat value, biodiversity value, and also to diversify your mix of timber products in the forest. Joan Hendricks, I see your hand up.
You unmuted.
Yeah, yeah. Eric's
Okay.
gonna tell a little story. We thinned 40 of our acres from 1991 to 1993.
Okay, and I didn't have to go very far. Here I've got a cross cut of the tree that just happened to fall down, and I cut it for firewood. But this, I don't know if, and yeah, you can see it. This is 92-year-old Douglas fir right there. And then it fell down. Then the property was logged. And then it grew from 92 years to 127. So you can really see where thinning, it was thinned, or, it had access to a lot more sunlight and water. It really took off. In here, you can't hardly count the rings. I did it with a magnifying glass. But out here, God, you can really see it good. Oh, that's kind of creepy. Yeah, it really went quite fast. It grew really fast. But on the other acreage of our property, we have 25-year-old trees that are this big or bigger.
Right, and
So-
they grew really fast because it was planted, and this forest, this 40 acres was naturally
Oh, yeah.
regenerated. Yeah.
So here's our old growth tree right here that I
Right.
burnt in the stove. And then it took off again. And now we have third growth trees that are actually much bigger than this. Then I've got another 40 acres. I'm going to start thinning 10 of it this spring, as soon as it dries up a little bit. So that's kind of
That's our
something else.
story.
That was right up on the shelf. I didn't have to go very far to get it.
Oh, that's
Thanks.
great. There's a perfect example of, how thinning can release the growth of trees, or the lack of thinning can keep a tree suppressed. Putting on very high quality lumber, I'll say that, but not putting much meat on the hoof year after year. So, that's another aspect of thinning. And Jaal kind of touched on the variable density thinning, leaving some areas a little denser, thinning some areas to a lower density. Through that kind of nuanced management, you really begin producing a broader range of timber products. In some cases, it's good to put a lot of volume on. That volume adds up quickly, but that can be a lower quality log product. If you've got trees that are growing a little more slowly somewhere else, have a tighter ring count, they may not be putting as much volume on, but it is producing a higher quality log product. And so if you have enough acreage where you can, play with your stocking density like that, you're diversifying your product line essentially. Scott, I see your hand up.
Yeah, the first question I had was already asked, and that had to do with replanting the thinned areas, the gaps. But then a follow-up question is, depending on, if the landowner's goal is to increase heterogeneity of their stand, and wants to replant with a different species in the thinned or the gap areas, I assume that would affect the size of the gaps that you'd create, based on the species of tree that you'd like to introduce to the stand. And so I suspect there's no clear answer to this, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, my basic mantra on tree selection, right tree, right location. So you need to know two things about the tree. It's shade tolerance, and it's soil moisture preference. So these usually fall out very cleanly that most shade tolerant trees prefer moister soils, and most of our shade intolerant trees, prefer drier soils. And that's not always the case. Red alder, of course, would be an exception to that. It likes, wetter soils, but it's not shade tolerant. So you're going to need to know that first. And if you have a smaller gap, and your soils will support shade tolerant trees, you could be certainly planting, hemlock, grand fir, spruce, perhaps cedar, and they'll grow, robustly in that gap because they're getting, a little more sunlight than they would in the understory of a forest. But if you're endeavoring to, replant Douglas fir, just as Jaal mentioned, that gap's going to need to be a little bit larger to get sunlight down into those fir. Another option with gaps too is you can plant multiple species. So you could be planting a shade tolerant species, say just within the southern edge, of that gap. That's going to be in the shade from the trees, to the south of that gap, and then the sun preferring trees, on the north side of that gap where the sunlight's coming down in. Little strategies like that.
I'm unmuted.
That's
That's
helpful.
the kind of conventional wisdom, I think, is that you need a pretty large opening to grow Doug fir. People would think something like 3 to 5 acre minimum. And I think that's probably true if you want, optimal 100% growth. But we've definitely seen Doug fir do pretty well in a much smaller gap. If you've got a half acre, even a quarter acre opening, I think you would have no problem growing Doug fir in there. It's just not going to grow, full speed. So it might need a little more help competing with vegetation and other, with the deer and everything. But you definitely can establish it with a little bit less light, especially if you've thinned around the gap and you've got some direct paths where sunlight might still be getting to it through the shade of those taller trees.
I would say that is one of the misnomers and sort of misconceptions of misperceptions of Douglas fir. Most conventional foresters say, well, if you want to grow Douglas fir, that's why you have to clear cut. It needs full sunlight, and it's not entirely true. Douglas fir is a moderately shade tolerant species, but to Jaal's point, if it is growing beneath the canopy of a forest, first of all, that canopy is going to have to be fairly open. It still does need more sunlight than the shade tolerant species. But just like Jaal said, it's going to grow much more slowly. So it kind of gets back to your objectives. I've seen, Douglas fir growing in the understory of forest or just within the understory of the edge, for years and years and years. It's not growing rapaciously, but it's growing. And I think at some point when you come along and thin the canopy or remove that dominant canopy, the fir is there that you can release. So, a lot of nuance to that, but I don't want anybody to leave here thinking that they have to clear cut just to grow Douglas fir. Well, I'll tell you what, we're a little after 8:30 here. Happy to take one or two more questions, but if people do feel like they need to drop off and get on with their evening, I just want to say thank you for joining us and look forward to having you back. But I think, at least speaking for myself, I'm happy to stick around for a little longer and continue to converse.
Yeah, I see we've got one question in the chat from Gene Austin, and about whether thinning causes weakness to the other trees that are left, and if so, how long for those trees' roots to become stronger? Any concerns of blowdown? And I think those are really good questions. And the first one about thinning causing weakness to their trees that are left, other trees' roots that are left, I would say it won't unless you have had some mechanical damage. If you had a tracked machine running really close to that leaf tree that's dug into the soil and damaged those roots, then that could cause some damage. But purely removing the neighbor of its neighboring tree doesn't seem to have any impact on the tree as far as causing weakness to it. But we do see concerns with blowdown in that trees that are on the edge of a forest are much more used to that wind and their roots are adapted to it. They've got stronger root systems. So if you take out the trees, especially on the edge of a forest, then the remaining tree, the new edge trees, the next row, are definitely going to be more susceptible to blowdown because they're not used to having that wind hitting them directly. And the same even just with thinning out a forest, especially if it's near the edge of a clear cut or a housing development or other open space, you're going to have more wind coming into the forest. So we'll often leave trees along the edge of, if there's a non-forested edge to the stand you're working in, we often will leave a buffer of unthinned trees, a few trees thick along the edge, because those trees are more used to the wind, and by leaving those, we'll have a lot less blowdown in the middle of the stand. But we always expect that after thinning, you're going to have a little bit of blowdown because you are just changing the dynamics of wind moving through the stand, and that's expected. And that can actually be a really good source of large downwood habitat in that forest. That if you expect that blowdown, and if you want to have, for example, 100 trees per acre, you might thin to 105 or 110 trees per acre and expect that you're going to have some come down naturally or die of other causes naturally.
Any other questions or any anecdotes that people care to share?
Jaal had mentioned market conditions can affect the choice of thinning. Can you talk a little about what we ran into last year with the prices of our pulp products, and do you have any insights as to what you're expecting to see in 2024?
Well, insights are always the tough one, of course. But yeah, what happened this last year was probably most people have heard the Tacoma paper mill shut down. And then that kind of threw a wrench into the whole pulp and paper pipeline in the Northwest. So suddenly there's way more pulp than anyone could actually use. And then as a result of the paper mill shutting down, one of the biggest chippers, Edmond in Tacoma, shut down. And then DePaul and Longview Fiber, other places that were still open, had way more than they knew what to do with, and they lowered prices and they didn't want it. And so that's been a struggle because every thinning, every harvest, especially thinnings, is going to have some smaller diameter wood, either from the tops of trees or from young trees. And generally that needs to go to a pulp mill to be able to pay its way out of the woods. So your other options, if you can't sell it, are either to leave it in the woods as habitat, which works okay in a thinning. It can still have some cost though, because their loggers done the work to take those trees down and process them, and they need to get paid for that one way or another. And if you're doing a clear cut, of course, it's hard to manage having all that extra material. You might have to chip it or ship it off site somewhere farther away at a big expense. What I will say is we've had much better luck this last year with FSC certified pulp, that we have been able to sell it, even though it's, you know, still not worth a lot. But that's been, FSC markets for pulp have stayed a little bit stronger than the otherwise standard markets. So that's been helpful. And looking forward later this year, what we keep hearing is that, you know, Longview Fiber has been working to increase capacity and trying to find ways to use more chips. I've heard talk of exporting more wood pellets overseas and just trying to scale up as much as possible, because with the price of pulp logs right now being so low, there's a lot of money in it for anyone who can figure out something to do with that material. So optimistic that they'll be able to get that together for this summer.
What a great note to end on. Optimism. We're optimistic for a better timber market this year, at least pulp market. Fingers crossed. All right. Well, I think with that, folks, I'm gonna call this to an end. Again, thank you in particular for your participation in the end here. These fireside chats, I think, are the most successful when everybody is chiming in, sharing their own anecdotes, and bringing their own questions to the meeting. So thank you all for that. I'm not sure what we're going to talk about next month. We rarely know month to month. We kind of make it up as we go along. But if any of you have a particular topic that you'd like us to cover during a future fireside chat, feel free to send a note to Rowan or Jaal or myself, and we'll be sure to get it on the calendar. So
Yeah.
Thanks again for joining, and until next time, so long, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone.